Welcome back, Rob here with the second part of my top 10 64 games list. So last week, if you haven't already checked it out, there'll be a link down below. I went through and just covered, 10 through 6 of my, the games I enjoyed the most, probably based on my original period ownership. And this week, it's now that second half, that top 5. As I sort of covered last week, this is basically of my original ownership days, and this list, if I were to redo it, think about it really hard from scratch, probably a bit more time based on stuff I've been getting and collecting, it would probably change a fair bit, but this is as it stands right now. So I'm going to be quiet and cut out with number 5 and go through that list. Now on to number 5, and that is Last Ninja 2, published by System 3. Back in the day, I really did get to play a lot of adventure games. Most of what I played tended to be, common text adventures that were found on magazine cover tapes. But out of the ones I did play, this has to be the one that stands out the most. Building upon the formula from the first game, Last Ninja 2 puts our hero in 80s New York, which is definitely one heck of a cliche, with his quest for hunting down the chap who murdered his clan continuing as always. The one thing I love with the new location is that it gave room for more varied scenery. If you look at the 7 stages, you have Central Park, the streets, sewers, a basement of an office building, the office building itself, and his mansion and the inner sanctum. The first game was sort of more centered around an islet, so it was a much smaller location. And while some didn't like the combat focus, it was a lot heavier focus on combat compared to its first game. I always found that was an excellent distraction as you sort of move through fort and then continue to explore. But one of the most important things for me is I think that out of all the 64 games I've played and enjoyed, this is the one that by far has the best all-round soundtrack. Most games might have, a couple of really, an excellent title theme and some nice jingles. Others might have just a loading tune that's spectacular. Here, it's an entire package. Each level and the loading of each level has its own distinct tune, except for the last stage, and that is gives you over an hour of music for that across that entire game. It's incredible, and it's hard. I mean, I've gotten recent memory, I got to level 3 without dying, and back in the day I could only ever complete it with cheats, but it's one of the ones I've always enjoyed playing. Here's number 4, Sensible Software's Whizball, again published by Ocean. At the top of things, it sounds like a bit of a surreal idea. You go through each of the levels, collect paint drops, and use them to colour each stage in. There's 3 colours that need to be collected to do that. But the thing is, you need to have a steady trigger finger. You need to go through, blast enemies to collect power-ups, and use those power-ups to upgrade your abilities, and also activate the catalyte, which is how you actually collect everything. And one of the things that's also cool, that I've never actually tried, is being able to play in 2 players cooperatively, with the second player handling the catalyte, which I can imagine makes the game a heck of a lot more playable, being able to not have to frantically switch controls. There's that atmosphere, there's a killer soundtrack, there's this atmosphere of the slightly out there-ish graphics and nature of the levels themselves, which of course is something Sensible were well known for back in the day. But it just plays really well, some great tight controls. And other than perhaps the opening starting point of the game, which I used to be really deep, I used to be a lot better at this when I was, back in the day. But zipping about the levels, collecting the power-ups, collecting the drops is something that is great fun. And it's become second nature with a bit of play after a while. And it's exactly what a great game needs on the system, if you ask me. And here's number 3, Imagine's conversion of Salamander. One of the things I think has to be said is, upon its original release in 1988, I think very few people thought that a game of this quality could be done. By this stage, 16-bit computers were coming up. Even it wasn't long before the 16-bit consoles were coming up, and arcade games had been 16-bit based for quite a while. And most other conversions tended to, not be that great. But here we are with an incredibly smooth conversion that is incredibly solid graphics, incredibly tight gameplay, and even with the traces of slowdown, the missing levels where there are 2 that weren't put in, factor in saving space for tape, what's here is incredibly well put together. The controls work great, the power-up system feels much more at home on the home computers, not just the C64, the other systems it was ported to. simply because you don't have to fumble and hit a second button that you don't have on the joysticks at the time. And even better, the difficulty is just perfect. Most shoot 'em ups have this thing where you have an incredibly high difficulty where it's just about, shoveling in your quarters to get as far as you can. Here the difficulty's been tweaked and smoothed out, so that actually is a completable challenge. And it's a game I just love being able to pick up, have a playthrough, and see how I go. It's a game that I'm just intimately familiar with, and it's one that I just love sitting down all the way. It is pure class on the 64, and easily my favourite arcade conversionals released. Coming out to sort of number 2 on the list has to be Jeff Crammond's Stunt Car Racer. There is a lot I've said about this game and how much I'm impressed with it, both the technology aspect as well as its overall gameplay. I mean, when it comes to 3D graphics on the 64, a lot of people write it off. They say the machine's too slow, and for most cases there are a lot of games that really were underwhelming. But when Stunt Car Racer was released, you can't help but see that in the hands of the right people, you can actually get really good 3D graphics on the 64. And I was completely blown away when I first saw it. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Most races are about either racing an approximation of a real life course, or going against checkpoints and trying to keep yourself playing as long as you can. Here you've got these magnificent stunt courses high above the ground, and it is some of the most intense racing I've ever seen. You're coming over incredibly tricky jumps, having to time, getting your speed right, because if you go too fast, you're going to go flying, and if you're going to go too slow, you won't even make the jump. So timing all these jumps, timing the course, and making sure that, when you come to some gigantic jump, that you can control that feeling of dread as you wonder, are you going to make it? And then you watch as you hit the track, right where you need it to be, and you can just let that sense of wonder take over as you just get back to getting on course. It's an experience that I really don't think any other game has done since, and it's something I think something that's definitely been missed out in racing games of this era. Finally, it's time for my number 1 game. If you've seen some of my other videos, you shouldn't be entirely surprised by what this is, as it's none other than Graph Gold's Paradroid. Your task is simple enough. Explore each deck of a giant space freighter and clear the droids that are present there. It stands out from a lot of games of its period, as it's more about tactics than about rapid reflexes or a quick trigger finger. As in order to be effective, you need to approach the decks in the right order, based on which droids are present. But the most important factor of the game comes into play. You control the influence device, a droid that has the ability to take over enemy robots for a short period of time. This also provides a change in scenery, so to speak, as you move away from the exploration and blasting elements and take over the droid in a quick puzzle sequence. When you do successfully take over a droid, you get a boost to your power, but you also get access to its capabilities. As you go through the decks, you'll find fairly simple robots, but towards the higher end of the spectrum, there are a lot of heavily armed military robots, and you'll get their weapons and other abilities. That leads to actually some of the most tense gameplay, as you might make your way up to a deck with a lot of high-ranking robots, and you'll find that you get blasted back to the influence device, and you need to frantically get away from that deck before you get the influence device destroyed, ending the game. The biggest challenge of this game is simply managing the balance between which decks you need to clear, whether you need to take over a droid, or whether you simply blast them, or whether you keep them around for later, for an emergency. But all of that combined with its presentation, you get helpful instructions built in, you can explore each deck, and you can get maps for the decks and for the ship plans. You can also access details about each robot that is below your current one, and the graphics, which actually immerse you, because instead of being, detailed sprites, it's a fairly abstract symbolic display, bringing in the immersion that you're accessing the influence device from a remote terminal. All of those combine to create an incredibly tense game, and when I think of the entire library, it stands out for me much for that tension. I've never really played any game on the 64 that's felt as tense as Paradroid, so it is my overall game on the system. So there we have it. That's my top 10, at least for right now. Thanks again for watching. I do hope you enjoyed both parts, as it was a great little exercise to at least think about these games and actually explain why I felt they fit into the list. As usual, I'm certainly interested in hearing what you think, so do leave a comment down below, And as always, if you happen to enjoy the video, please leave a thumbs up as well. I also have some links in the description to part 1, along with some of the gameplays I've done for games that appeared in this list. And as always, if you did enjoy it, and you've not already, please do consider subscribing to the channel. I usually upload a gameplay video every week, along with some other bits and pieces, mostly but not always about the C64. And of course, if you've already subscribed, thanks again for that. Catch you on the next one.